Hi, everyone. Welcome to Poet. I'm Radha Marcum, and today I have the pleasure of talking to poet Tina Carlson, author of A Guide to Tongue-Tie Surgery, among other books. Before I introduce you to Tina, I'd like to invite you to become a subscriber of the Poet to Poet newsletter on Substack if you aren't already. Just go to poettopoet.substack.com and subscribe for free. In it, you'll find interviews like this one, plus helpful ideas on writing and publishing books of poetry. So again, today I'm thrilled to introduce you to Tina Carlson. Tina is a poet living in New Mexico. Her first book, Ground, Wind, This Body, which was published by University of New Mexico Press in 2017, deals with the theme of what can happen to a family when a veteran has not gotten help for their trauma. She's the co-author of a beautiful book called We Are Meant to Carry Water, which is from Three House Press 2019, which was the winner of a New Mexico Arizona Book Award for Poetry Anthology. And that is a book of persona poems written in response to the 2016 US presidential election. Her most recent book, again, is A Guide to Tongue-Tie Surgery, which we're going to be talking about today. And that is just out from University of New Mexico Press. And she's got a chapbook called Obsidian, which is going to be published this year as well by Dancing Girl Press. So Tina, welcome to Poet to Poet.
Thanks, Radha. I'm honored to be here.
So I would love to start with a question about the book's origin. Can you share a little bit about the process of developing the poems for this book and where those poems started?
Yeah, so the oldest poem in the book is called Westside Murders, actually. At the time that I wrote that poem, I was working in healthcare for the homeless in Albuquerque, and a lot of sex workers in Albuquerque were being murdered by a serial killer who, to this day, I don't believe has been found or caught. And I didn't know any of the women who were murdered, but I had as clients a lot of women who knew those women and were very fearful. And what was happening at the time is no one was talking about it. There were a few newspaper articles. It was very sort of underground because these women didn't have cultural worth, I guess. And it was always questionable what was really going on there. And so I started to feel that not that I could give voice to those women, but I wanted to give voice to the horror and also to the humanity of the women that were being killed. And so I wrote the poem Westside Murders in an attempt to sort of put it out there in the face. And I actually was honored to read it in front of the Senate of New Mexico in the Roundhouse because Linda Lopez had put forward a memorial to remember these women and to keep looking for the killer, but also to make an actual memorial towards them. So I was really engaged in this notion of how we give voice or at least notice to the voiceless. And that was sort of the genesis of the idea of the book is like, how do I a lot of persona poems, and also how do I feel my way into the experience of, say, an ancestor or a fairy tale character, or even a lampshade or a metronome, even in inanimate objects. And that was sort of the genesis of the idea of the book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, persona poems and that challenge of inhabiting another way of thinking about the world is
Yeah.
a really potent thread throughout the poems and throughout the book. Does that relate to the title? And how did
Yes.
you choose the title?
Yeah, so I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner. It's my profession, and I work my area of expertise is perinatal mental health, which is pregnancy and postpartum. And so I hear about tongue-tie surgery a lot. It's a surgery done on infants to unlatch the tongue when it's tied too tightly to the bottom of the mouth so that they can latch and feed. But it's also kind of surgery done on adults for better speech or better eating quality. And it seemed an apt metaphor at the time for my mother, who I have a long and complicated relationship with, who was basically, I think, as a child, as many women were in the 50s, in the 30s and 40s and 50s, shut down their voices and just, have to be nice and be taking care of everyone else. And she was always telling us about this experience as a child where her mouth was washed out with soap whenever she'd say like a bad word or something her parents didn't like, which I found horrifying. I guess at the time it was kind of normal, but seemed like an apt metaphor for silencing. And I just conflated those. I had this idea that A Guide to Tongue-Tie Surgery actually is the name of a poem about my mother. But that in some ways it encompassed the theme of the book of just in a sort of more surreal way, how do we all promote the kind of excavation or kind of maneuver where we can unlatch the tongue and start speaking more the truth or things that may be unpopular or maybe fierce. So that's sort of where that came from.
Yeah, yeah, amazing. It's such an evocative title. So,
Thank you.
yeah. Would you like to read a poem for us to hear a little bit
Sure.
of
I
what's
could
going
read
on?
that one. I'll read that poem since we've been talking about it. A Guide to Tongue-Tie Surgery. Say excavation, exoneration. My mother's mouth washed out with soap. In that cool cocoon, a salmon caught in stones, bird flapping in a trap, cheek swab, sea snail. Show me how a smile hides argument behind its teeth. Ask her, what words made your crimes? She ate wood, sampled leather, grazed the backyard of her alphabets. Grass cats lumbered the clods of her thoughts. We tumbled through her silent gardens, filled them with noise. To untether the tongue, say frenulum, say frenzy, a simple snip and drop of blood. Let her taste peaches, warm June. I imagine my mother is more than apology, flag planted in her throat, unfurled past mumble and scorn. Poplar at dawn, she is lingual.
Hmm. I feel like I could listen to that poem maybe another 10 times and
Oh,
and feel in each iteration of it a different resonance. I think I don't know how you describe your style, but to me, it feels not only sonically rich, but also really embracing of this associative mind, the surreal or dreamlike quality of sort of an emotional landscape. And yet, every poem in this book really feels lived. So, how do you think about the relationship between the surreal nature of these poems and your lived experiences? Do they correlate for you?
oh yeah, definitely. Um, I don't know how to live in the world without the surreal or without magic or mystery. I don't know that I would have survived, frankly, without that. It's always been part of my being, I would say, since an early child. I've had very vivid dreams that in many cases have created maps for the way that I went ahead in my life, and in other cases gave me a way to understand what was happening that might have been difficult or for which there were really no clear logical words or understandings. So I feel like it's sort of the path of least resistance almost for me, that to just write for me, just the bare truth of things feels maybe a little raw and maybe too much and maybe dishonoring human experience, which is broad and wide and has so much possibility for transformation. Um, and I find in my work dealing with many women who've been very traumatized and now are having babies and wanting to do it differently, that if I can bring that into the practice as well and ask them, what are you dreaming? Like, basically, what are your dreams for your life, but also what kind of dreams are you having? Often it creates a more expansive container to do the work in of healing for them. So I find it really valuable in life. And then in poetry, it's just so much fun to draw on those aspects that are maybe not settled in the logical mind, but live in all of us, I believe.
Yeah. Well, you said maps to describe, some of what's going on, and a guidance, maps,
Yes,
map making, sort of describing a territory in terms other than just our, sort of logical, sanctioned viewpoints.
good
Um,
word, sanctioned, I think.
those
Yeah,
being a way to walk through an emotional territory, make sense of an emotional territory, and heal.
yeah.
Seems very much the work of poetry. So it's interesting to hear how that comes out in your work.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I hope that it comes out in everything I do because it really is it's a kind of I love the word metamorphosis. Um, I feel that, like just like you said, we have these scripts that we're sort of born with generationally and culturally, that if we just live according to those scripts, we don't really necessarily evolve very much. And it can feel at times very hopeless because some of those scripts are very constricting. And I'm always about trying to explore how to expand the story, how to we're so capable of transformation as beings, and how do we manifest that? It can't just be through logical linear mind, I don't think. That's very helpful in the daily life, but in terms of real change and transformation, I think sort of the mystery, um, the artistic, the creative imagination gives us so much more.
Yeah. Yes. Would you like to read another poem?
Sure, I'd love to. I'll read one that has a map in it. It's one of the fairy tale ones, and this poem is a takeoff on the Medusa myth, um, and really deals with is the woman who was cursed to have hair that her hair was turned into snakes, and her gaze um, froze men when they looked at it, and she was beheaded. And when she was beheaded, her two sons came out of her neck. This is such a story about transformation for me. Um, so Pegasus is who this story is about. He is one of her sons. He is a flying horse. And the poem's genesis is I was looking through these ancient maps. I don't know why or how I came to be doing that. And there's actually a map of ancient Asia in the shape of Pegasus, the flying horse, that was, made eons ago. I found that so fascinating. And so I actually wrote this poem inspired by that map that I found. It's called Until I Could No Longer Fly, and So Became a Map, Pegasus. Just before prayer, my mother slept in a sea of snakes, her holy, her grist, bone meal, and blood. I swam between her continents of heartbeat and lung. She was throat pulled open and slit. Her quieted voice made me winged, and I fled from that nape. I flew. Through clouds small as fists I rose, serpents taut as tongues on my back. Cinched by men who wanted the sun, I rode them out of the stone of her gaze. My mother's song, a hover and flame in barracks on the ground. I wanted to gallop and nap, wanted to feed at her feet. How she bled down the stairs like pomegranates, her hands rising in prayer before the death of my birth, fetlock and dock, withers and croup. My shadow a stream bed, my glass into stars. Old now, I flank a map. I am muzzle of plains. In these days of war, Rivers glint in my haunches. I drink from oceans of the missing and yearned. I am hobble and bruise in the dark dirt. My mother, my maker, now daybreak and flaw. Smoke and flower flush plucked out of her gaping hands.
Mm. It's such a rich imaginative landscape that we're drawn into, and yet there's these moments like I I hope I'm not going to miss-say this, but I rode out of the stone of her gaze. Is
That's
that
exactly. Mhm.
um where I just, I think all of us sort of flash on moments again of like a lived experience of some kind in which we, again are subject to the gaze of an elder that's disapproving, and the power of story to sort of fly up in the, literally Pegasus is flying up in the face of this. There's just so many truths, I guess I want to say, in that storytelling.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for saying that. I had never thought of that, what you just said about the stone of her gaze, but I think you're right. I mean, I keep finding things too in the language that I didn't know. It teaches me new things. There's a certain level of paradox in life, right? So I feel like Pegasus, while needing to flee in order to save himself, also feels a great deal of tenderness and love for his mother, and grief, and honoring of her, at the same time needing to leave her. Um, and I isn't that the story of so many people too? And I think there's that paradox. We get confused in our culture thinking we have to feel one way about something. And that's nearly impossible. There are things that I probably feel one way about, but most things have all kinds of sides and innuendo and nuance.
Mhm.
And I love the old myths because they're full of paradox. And it's fun to just sort of play with that in poems.
Yeah, yeah, there you go. Keats's negative capability
That
still so relevant for us, maybe even more relevant than in other times. Just I I start to think about how polarized we are in our opinions and how much the culture demands of us that we
pick aside.
be narrow, and and that uh, somebody described it as the tyranny of or, right? This
Mhm.
or that, versus I think poets are very much in this space of trying to knit those things together and say, let's go for that
Exactly.
and really, I mean, how much
Paradox.
more really is so relevant, and to try to preserve um, a mind that is whole and not split in those ores.
I love what you're saying. That's beautifully said. And I think working in mental health, people don't thrive. Mental health does not thrive in us when we're in the tyranny of or. And there are mental health treatments that actually deal with embracing paradox in order to expand our view of things and our ability of ourself to be larger too. Um, our self-concept, but our actual self as well. Yeah.
So there are a lot of different themes in the poems in the book. Um, Fairy tales, family, mythology, dreams, maps. Once you so how long did it take you to generate the poems for the book once you had a certain number? How did the organization of the book come to be? Was it something that came very easily? Did you struggle to see how things related? I'm curious about that structuring.
Great question. And no, it was not easy. That's not an easy thing for me to do in general. I appreciate that you do a lot of work with people, helping them figure out how to create manuscripts, because I don't feel like I really know how. I tried a number of different ways of sequencing it. And I also got a lot of help from other people who tried to help me sequence it. In the end, though, I sort of did this. I read this article by Diane Seuss. I just love her so much because she's always just imploring the poet to just sort of go with your intuition, which sounds simple. It isn't necessarily easy. But that's what I did. I just basically laid it all out on the floor and I just thought, okay, just let yourself really associate, like you say, with the associative mind, how these poems want to sit next to each other in the book. And that actually wasn't very hard, but it was after probably a year or two of trying to do other things. I mean, this was not a short process. And what ended up, I think, falling out that I might describe is some of the really biographical poems about my own family sort of headline the book. And then there's a series of sort of what I would call horrific poems. I mean, they're about horrific themes. Hopefully the poems are not too horrible to read, but they're about the Westside Murders are in there. I mean, just sort of horror, but also the little inklings then of transformation. And then as the book goes on, I'm interested in more transformation, more metamorphosis, bringing in more of the myths and more of this sense of like creating new maps. And so that's sort of the thrust of the book is taking sort of what you and I talked about at the beginning of this interview, taking those original scripts or those original stories where our origin stories as people, as a culture, as whatever, right? And expanding those into something transformational. And that was my desire intuitively in sequencing the book.
Mhm.
Whether I accomplish that, I don't really know. I guess that's up to the reader to decide, but that was my intention.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it feels like that when you read the book. And I'm a reader who likes to dip in and out. And so I don't
Yeah.
always get the full arc until maybe the second or third reading.
Yeah.
Um, and but I, I I wanted to maybe ask you about that idea of the arc, right? The idea of transformation, um, because it's something that one might get stuck on. This idea that you have to transform and the transformation is complete. Do you think
That's
of
the linear mind trying to turn transformation into a linear thing.
right. So is there a nuance to that idea that we might be going from tongue-tied to more fully voiced, and yet it still remains complicated?
That's beautifully said. I love that. And that's the paradox that as we gain more ability to view life in a more expansive, paradoxical way, doesn't mean life is any easier. In fact, it's more complicated. But I think it's rich
Hmm.
and I think it's reality, right? That it's complicated and yet it's so full of awe and wonder. And so, yes, from the simplified, maybe this is what's true, to the wow, I don't know what's true, but I sure am in awe of what I'm experiencing right now. And that itself is transformative, not that there's an outcome that we're looking for necessarily. It's more a state of being more curious, being less like, I know everything, to I don't know. What are the questions I want to ask today? What am I curious about? How do I find connection with other beings in a deeper way? That impulse rather than, I'm an individual and I'm important and you better listen to what I have to say kind of thing, which is so tiresome. We're all so tired of that.
Yeah,
Does that,
makes so much sense.
yeah. Yeah, well, you kind of said it really well, I think.
um, it feels really important to give poets permission to not have some point, right, that's being driven at. I feel that for the students that I am in workshop with and am guiding in this process of poem making, that there is this tremendous pressure on us right now to say something.
Yeah.
And
Meaning,
that's a
yeah.
dangerous space for us to be in as poets. And um, in no way am I suggesting that we shouldn't confront very challenging and difficult topics, just as you are. But I think that this, bringing that intention into a space that has a lot of complexity and a lot of nuance and a lot of ability to work in abstract or surreal or emotional modes feels like the task.
Yeah. Oh boy, I just love how you articulate things. So glad you're doing this series. Um, yeah, that's right. It really comes down to a sense of how do we how do we write things that are meaningful to us, but also are stretching, and craft is in there. Um, what's charging us, what's interesting to us is in there. Our imagination is part of it. I think what I'm loving what you're saying is, I guess would be my advice to new poets too, is like, don't constrict yourself to what you think you're supposed to be doing here, because that's sort of the opposite. That's the opposite action. Our brains we don't even understand our own brains, but our brains are miraculous organs and have so much more ability to understand things than we even know, right? We can't even understand our own brains. We can't even, researchers have very little understanding of what's going on up there. And to me, that's just a sense of such possibility for creative people, of like, there's these unknown reaches even within our own brains that we can explore if we're not constricted by certain, like you say, rules or tenets, or now this is what poets have to write about, or this is how you have to write about it. Again, Diane Seuss, I'm such a big fan of hers, is always saying, write about what moves you, start there. That's where you're going to find the juice. And then, craft and everything will come into that. But let yourself go in a way into the awe of and wonder of what really animates you as a writer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I feel this is all of these ideas are so present in your book, and your book is such a gift to poets as a model for how to do this kind of work. So thank you for these beautiful poems. Would you like to read maybe one last poem for us?
Sure. I will end with the poem Avalanche, which is a persona poem written in the voice of the avalanche. This is in memory of one of my early climbing teachers who died in an avalanche. Avalanche. Think of me final. Think of me fast, of fracture, flame of crust, cold and folded over the rise and fall of generation, of tumble and low, the whirl, the wave, the slack and the spin. I remember you young, tasting earth with your feet, the girth and heft of hills. Have you loved enough the smell and lick of storm, the hymns of dirt, the pine, the rise, the crest, the summit now sung in snow? Bed the boom, the breath, the lavish white of your vanishing.
Mm. It just catches me right there. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, powerful and elegiac and elemental, and so many ways that poem is working on all those levels, visually, emotionally, sonically, rhythmically. Um, Again, I could just listen to it probably another 10 times and keep hearing the nuances there. Um, so I wonder if you might have any advice for poets who are putting together collections. Is there anything that you wish you'd known earlier? Maybe thinking back to even before you had your first book. What would you encourage poets to think about?
Well, I think it's helpful to, first of all, be in some kind of group or some have some support in some way, attend workshops, be in a writing group, just to have the support. It takes a lot of work to amass enough poems for a collection, first of all, and it's helpful to have other people's eyes on them, and particularly in a supportive way, not super critical, but in terms of learning more craft, so that the poems are well revised and crafted, I think, for a collection. It's not really just about writing a whole bunch of poems and then seeing if they all fit in a collection. It's really, there is a guidance, but it's sort of an intuitive guidance, if I might say. So, um, if you're writing, if you're trying to write toward a collection, I would say, sort of what we said earlier, don't get stuck in too narrow of a passageway towards that. Because the associative mind will want to bring in other things. It will say, oh, this might really, go with that. You can always take things out, but I think it makes a collection so much more interesting when there's some poems in there where you're like, wow, kind of surprise you. It's not like, okay, now we're going to the next which is just a little few steps further from the last one or whatever, the same theme all the way through that's so logical. So allow yourself some fun and mystery in the associative process. And I think, again, other poets can see those sometimes better than we can. I think some of these poems came because I might have written a poem and people that I knew or in a group or a workshop would say, you keep talking about such and such, like I was talking about snow a lot. That's actually where that Avalanche poem came. You're always talking about snow. And what if you just went for it, and just wrote more poems about snow? I didn't even see that I was doing that, actually, but I grew up in Colorado. Um, so things like that other people can see. So I guess I'm really advocating for a lot of support, and then also not getting too narrow. It's sort of, here we are with the paradox again, not just writing 70 poems and throwing them together, but also not feeling like you have to, this is going to be a poem, this is going to be a book about whatever, the history of my family or about shipbuilding or whatever theme that you're interested in, and then just sticking solidly to that theme, but also allowing your dreams or the associative mind or other poets to say, hey, here's another piece of that maybe you didn't think of that you might want to explore. I think that makes the collection more interesting.
Yeah. 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 I think that's a really common experience that I hear from other poets too, that they will have been subconsciously working on a theme or a motif, right? A motif like snow.
Yeah.
That they didn't realize they had been,
Yeah.
sort of obsessed with in the background of the mind in some way, and then that
Right.
emerges through this contact with other readers or with other poets, and it's a really magical, it's sort of a magic that happens or can happen in a group like that, or with people that you trust and can turn to for that kind of perspective.
Yeah, again, that's beautifully said, the way you just said that, of for a different perspective. Yeah, I think book manuscripts are collaborations. I mean, I've done a true collaborative manuscript where we really wrote it together, but I think, at least for me, the books I've written are tremendous collaborations with quite a number of people. And I think that makes it rich. I don't think it's something we're just meant to sit down and write and then put out there and get published. I think that cross-pollination that occurs with other poets and even the non-poets,
Mhm.
um, all kinds of people can help us pollinate our work, makes it much richer and actually is stronger as well.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Well, Tina, so in closing, where can people find you, your work? Where should we direct people to learn more?
I have a website, tinacarlsonpoetry.com, and then I also, the University of New Mexico Press has my books. Um, yeah, those are probably the best places.
Great, Great. Well, Tina, it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this interview.
Thank
And
you so much for inviting me. What fun it's been. Really enjoyed it.
thank you.